if you're not already there, please turn with me to Hebrews chapter 4. And tonight, we are going to be covering the last few verses in chapter 4 and then most of chapter 5. You might notice some of your Bibles might even have a heading on verse 14, kind of breaking up chapter 14 and kind of blending it right in with chapter 5. So listen as I read God's word aloud. Chapter 4, verse 14. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us take hold of our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things like we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest is taken from among men, is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins, being able to deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself also is beset with weakness. And because of it, he is obligated, just as for the people, to also offer sacrifices for sins in the same way for himself. And no one takes this honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. In this way also, Christ did not glorify himself to become a high priest, but he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," just as he says also in another passage, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." He, in the days of his flesh, offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. This is the word of the Lord. So we're going to be working through this chapter, or these passages, kind of splitting 4 and 5 tonight. But before we get there, let's just real quick review and run through Hebrews up to this point. So chapter 1, the opening, scroll on the screen. What are we talking about in Hebrews chapter 1? What's the big idea entering this book? All right, Jesus is better than angels. Even before that, going through those first 4 verses in chapter 1, what do we find out about this book and what the author is trying to tell us? Yes. That's there in those first few verses. Chapter 1. God has revealed himself to his Son. Okay, yes, that God has spoken, right? God has spoken many times, many ways, through prophets and visions and all that kind of stuff. But now, he has spoken through his Son. And Jesus, really bringing this revelation of God to us, really being the gospel, has now been revealed to all the world, really. And we get this transition there in chapter 1. This Jesus, this revelation bringer, is now better than what? Angels. Now, why does the author go towards angels? Okay, so the angels used to be a messenger, well, they still are, right? But they're messengers of God. And what was their role in their message? What was the message they delivered, especially in the Old Testament? The law, right? The Old Covenant. And so the temptation for these people was one, maybe just to turn to angels, because angels are like kind of like the superheroes of this context, in probably Italy or somewhere in the Mediterranean. But not only that, turning away from Jesus and turning back to the law, the thing that had been delivered by the angels, would be bad, right, for these people. It would be basically rejecting what God has done in speaking through this Son. And so we see that Jesus is better than angels. Why in chapter 1? What's the reason the author gives in chapter 1? Because he is the Son and the Son of God, right? His deity is really proclaimed in chapter 1. Jesus is better than the angels because he's God. And so he's the ruler, he has a throne, he's eternal, he's the creator. None of those things are true of the angels. Okay, and now chapter 2. So I'm just kind of keep this outline flowing in your mind. Chapter 2, beginning of chapter 2, what do we have? It's a key thing that we're going to see in the book of Hebrews. We have a warning. Okay, what is the warning there in chapter 2? Right, don't drift away, right? Hold fast to this truth. Now, what is the purpose of a warning in general? Yeah, to protect you, right? To guard you from the thing that will be detrimental to you, that will hurt you, that will drive you off of the path. And so in the book of Hebrews, we're going to have a series of warnings. And so we saw a warning in chapter 2, don't drift away. And then kind of we pick back up on that theme of angels, because Jesus is better than angels because of another kind of the second argument, which is that. What is that second argument? Yeah, he's a man, and he's a perfect man, right? He fulfills what God intended for humanity. He is the man in that sense. And so he's better than an angel because he can accurately and fully fulfill what God has intended for humanity. And we also see that he's a man and that he suffers. He experiences temptation. We're going to talk about that a lot tonight. And that he also experienced death. He tasted death. But he did that for a purpose. And so kind of there at the end, closer to the end of chapter 2, so that he could free those who are under this fear of the slavery of death. So he could save people. Okay, so then chapter 3, we have kind of another set of warnings, some exhortations. But what's chapter 3 about? Say that again? Yeah, Jesus is greater than Moses, okay? And so this is kind of a change. But really the idea is that if the generation that was following really the servant of the house, Moses, if that generation who was following Moses turned away from Moses, rejected God's word that was being delivered there, and turned away in unbelief, and because of that, they were judged and punished and kind of faced eternal consequences for that, then the idea is how much greater is the risk for not just rejecting the servant of the house, but the son of the house. Right? If you disobey the son, if you don't believe the son, if you reject the son and his message, then kind of the implication is there's going to be an even greater judgment for you, an even greater danger for you, really. And so that danger is unbelief, right? This unbelief, this hardened heart will cause one to not enter what? God's rest. So we saw last week then in chapter 4 that God's rest, this idea of rest, is really eternal in the sense that entering into God's rest is being with God for eternity. And this is kind of the exhortation that's being brought about in this chapter is to kind of grab everyone and say, together, right, we are going to not turn aside unbelief, not harden our hearts. We're going to pursue God. We're going to follow him and get into this rest, enter this rest. We're going to grab one another and go. Because there still remains for all of us, for the believers that were in this time and for us today, a rest to enter into with God. Okay, so now we are getting to the end of chapter 4, and we kind of briefly touched on these verses last time, but we're getting into our kind of the next major section of the book of Hebrews. And the first section was this idea of Jesus is better than angels, and we kind of have this idea of Jesus is better than Moses and Joshua, and especially kind of the things that they were dealing with. Well, now we're going to get another kind of angle on this idea of Jesus being better. And it's foreshadowed already from the passages we've seen. So it was in our memory verse, chapter 2, verses 17 through 18, Jesus being his high priest. And it's also there in verse 1 of chapter 3. And it's kind of even there at the very beginning of the letter, where it talks about Jesus having made purification and then sitting down at the right hand of God. And so tonight we're going to be talking about this high priest and this idea of a high priest. And we're going to be trying to jump into the shoes, so to speak, of the person that would be receiving this and understanding this. Because I think, again, our default can maybe be that Jesus, and I'm not accusing people of this, I'm just saying that perhaps this can be our thought, is that Jesus had to be a high priest because God kind of had high priests in the Old Testament. He had this priestly system in the Old Testament, so Jesus had to be a high priest. And so in the New Testament, here in Hebrews, the author's just trying to show us, like, Jesus is also a high priest. But it's really the other way around. We have a priestly system. We have this system of sacrifices. We have a high priest in the Old Testament because God wanted to have something to point to who Jesus is and what Jesus was going to do. And so let's go ahead and start here on verses 14 through 16 of our first main heading. And this is really going to be the thesis for this next section and really through all the way through chapter 10. This is going to be kind of an idea that's going to be present. And we start with this word, therefore. And so this is an important word, obviously. We talk about the therefores all the time. But this word is specifically important because we have to figure out, is this section connected just to the immediate following verses that were just preceding it, or is this really starting a new theme, a new section of the letter, so to speak? And studying it today and kind of reading some things, I do think that this is really it's a big transition. Right? This, therefore, is not just talking about verses 12 and 13, but it's really almost picking up on ideas that have been sprinkled throughout the letter and kind of pulling things together, and he's starting a new point. And so you could really say that he's picking up on the theme of priesthood that he's already mentioned there in chapter 2. And so we have this common idea again, right? Old covenant, new covenant. Moses or angels were the deliverers of the old covenant. Now we have Jesus as the mediator of the new covenant. Moses was the one instituting the Sinai covenant with all of its stipulations. Now we have Jesus, right, who is able to really represent us and call us to follow him as the son of the house. And now we're going to see that we had this Levitical priesthood, but now we have a better priesthood. And it's the same idea over and over again, turning away from what is better to the old thing that was meant to point to the better thing, is a fatal mistake. And so we see, therefore, since we have a great high priest, and really the idea of great is not to say this is a special title, or it's like, oh, he's the great high priest. You have your regular high priest and your great high priest. But it's really just showing the degree of uniqueness and his excellence as a priest. And we get to our idea connecting word, high priest. This is kind of where we can say, okay, he's talking about things earlier in the letter, not even in chapter 4. And maybe he's even bringing this up, not just because he wants to talk about high priest things, even though he's going to be doing that for the rest of the book, really. But maybe it's because there is this idea that Jews were telling Christians that you guys aren't really that great because you don't even have a priesthood anymore. Right? Christianity has no priesthood. And so perhaps even in this context, the author is trying to refute this idea and going, no, actually we have a better priesthood. We need to see our high priest better. It's not that we don't have one, it's that you're not recognizing who he is. Okay, so we have a great high priest. And again, this priestly system is designed to point to Jesus. He's not a priest because it just worked out that way. It's because this was all meant to point to who Jesus is and what he's doing. And now we get this reminder of Christ's priestly work. So he's passed through the heavens. That's kind of a vague, excellent-sounding thing, passed through the heavens. What does that mean? It really just means that he has completed his mission, that he's passed through the heavens, that he's sitting in the throne, he's done. So he's passed through the heavens, he's accomplished his job. But now we have this interesting title, Jesus the Son of God. Why do you think we have that title where it is kind of just stuck right there? It's kind of even meant to be prominent in the way it's even worded in Greek. Jesus the Son of God. What is that title telling us about this high priest? Okay. Yeah, in what way? Jesus is? Sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Yes. Okay, yeah, we're going to get to that part in a second. But yes, okay, so clearly we're seeing that all of a sudden Jesus, right, we have a name. We have a name that's like really tied to a human identity. And so what the author is trying to do here is he's trying to zoom us back in and say, look, we're talking about a man, Jesus, right, the human Jesus that we are shared about in our gospel, the Son of God. He's taking the human, he's taking the divine, and he's trying to connect them right here for us to see that this priest is human and divine. He's human and God, which is different, right? It's different than anything that we've really had so far in the Old Testament. And so he's pointing to this identity, this human and divine identity. And now we see kind of this next exhortation, hold fast. This is going to be really the theme kind of going forward through these next few chapters of holding fast to this confession. So earlier in the book, we had the same word. Probably for most of you all in your translations, it was the same word. So where else have we seen this exhortation to hold fast? So I'm looking specifically, I'm thinking about chapter 3, verse 6. Right, kind of within that warning that Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope. All right, so we have this repeated word, but actually what's interesting is that the word here in chapter 4 is a different word than the word there in chapter 3. And so even though for most of our English translations it's going to come across the same, there's a slightly different nuance there. So in chapter 3, it's talking about holding fast to this hope, and it's really this idea of being loyal. So not turning away from Jesus, being loyal to the Son over the house, not rejecting him. Well, here in verse 14 of chapter 4, we're told to hold fast again, but this time it's like holding tight like on a roller coaster, like clinging on is the idea. It's this idea of persevering that we're going to see a lot. And so the author here is telling us, right, therefore, since we have a great high priest, right, this high priest who is God and man, you need to cling on, hold fast, persevere in your confession. We've talked about confession before. What is kind of embodied in that word? Yeah. I mean, it's kind of this idea of your faith, like your faith, your gospel output in that sense of what you know. But your doctrine of your belief in God. It's not even like, well, like our Presbyterian brothers, right? They have the Westminster Confession of Faith, and it's like defend and hold fast to this confession. That's not the idea here. The idea here is your confession of Jesus as Lord of your life, You need to hold fast to that. You need to persevere and cling to that. And he's going to give us a reason why we can hold fast. And I think another way to think about this holding fast idea, remember in chapter 2, we had this kind of warning, don't drift away. And there is kind of this idea of there's a passivity, right? Is you just kind of like, you let go of the rope by the dock, and you just kind of, your boat just moves away. You're not by the land anymore. You're not safe. Well, in the sense of that was like a passivity, this holding fast is an active, engaged way of clinging on and looking to persevere. And the reason why is really going to be kind of outlined in verses 15 and 16. He says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses." So we have like a double negative. It's not the way that we like to speak in English. But what he is saying is that we have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses. We have a high priest who is actually able to save us because he can identify with us. And so we have a priest who is able to sympathize. And the idea behind this word, and in English it's kind of tricky to figure out like kind of the difference between empathy and sympathy and like how those kind of mesh and blend. But really the idea is kind of more like empathy here. It's the idea of having such a tight relationship with somebody, like a brother or sister or even like a twin is the way it's kind of formulated, that you can feel their pain. Like you understand what it is when they hurt. And that's the sympathy that we see here. And why is he able to sympathize with us, with our weaknesses? What are our weaknesses? What do you think he's talking about there? All right, temptations.
Or drift away from the gospel, the foundation of the truth.
Yes, yeah, that kind of gets at some of it. Really, this is kind of the package deal of saying that our high priest, this high priest, is able to sympathize with our weaknesses, with our frailties. That's a fun word to, yeah. I shouldn't have said that word. I can't say it. Our weaknesses, right? With every kind of issue and suffering and trial that a human has experienced, he understands it. He knows about it. He's intimately acquainted with the human condition. And in particular, kind of getting what Anju was talking about, he knows what it's like to see the delights and the joys and the allures of sin. He's not blind to that. He had to live life and see those things and be around it. And so in that way, he knows the sources of our temptations. It's not some gray category to him. He knows all of it. And yet, the most amazing thing is that he shared in those weaknesses in that sense, but he never once gave in to sin, which is what the author is now going to make a point of saying at the end of verse 15. So he can sympathize with our weaknesses, but as one who has been tempted in all things like we are, yet without sin. So why does he have so much empathy? Well, he was tempted in all things. So let's kind of work through this verse because it's worded a little bit clunkily in English, but it's talking about very important things, very important doctrines about who Jesus is and what his life was like. So let's work backwards through it. Let's start with the end there. Yet without sin. Is that how most of y'all's translations render that? Anyone have anything different? Okay. Well, what's another way that you could think to say this? What's it getting at? Yet without sin. What's that idea there?
Perfect, holy.
Yeah, that Jesus didn't sin, right? That's another way you could say it theoretically, right? Is that Jesus didn't sin. Right. Yeah, and we're going to get there even more clearly in kind of that next little part. But I just want you guys to focus in on the yet without sin part. Because he could have said Jesus didn't sin, right? And kind of made it kind of that active sense of like he didn't like sin, as in there's a verb there. And yet instead he describes it in this passive way. He was yet without sin, as like in the noun form. Yes. Yes. And so what's he getting at? Why is there a difference in the way he's saying this? What is he trying to talk about? Well, he's talking about the nature of Christ, his nature. And namely, that he did not have a sin nature. It's not that he didn't sin because of like some like superpower or something. It's that he had a different nature in that he couldn't sin in that sense. But this is very important for us. The beginning of Romans 8 talks about kind of the same things. And it says that Christ was made in the likeness of sinful flesh. Now, when we say like, right, sometimes we're meaning like, oh, it's the same thing. Yet, here we have to really be clear on the similarities and the differences. So if Christ was made exactly like sinful flesh, and that he was sinful flesh, he was a sinner, right, then that's a big problem for us. Why? Yeah, he can't actually help us. He can't actually be perfect in our place. Yes?
One verse says he was tempted and he suffered.
Yes.
Which really makes you understand that it wasn't just, oh, I can't sin, it's nothing to me.
Right. Yeah, and we're gonna talk about that right now. Because we see that he's like us, but he's also not like us. And I think, and you probably have experienced this if you're trying to explain it to somebody else. That like this is a hard thing to talk about, a hard thing to explain. Like you understand that it's really important, but it's like how and why. And thankfully, there are people in this world who have thought about these things and have written about these things in really helpful, clear ways. Because when we say that he was tempted in every way, I think kind of the clearest way to describe that is he was tempted beyond our ability really to even understand and to experience temptation. Yet he never gave in. And so C.S. Lewis has this wonderful quote about this in Mere Christianity, and I just stole the whole thing. I'm going to read it to you right now. Because I think it does a really good job of explaining this idea. So here's C.S. Lewis. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. No man knows how bad he is till he has tried very hard to be good. A silly idea is current that good people do not know what temptation means. This is an obvious lie. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. After all, you find out the strength of the German army by fighting against it, not by giving in. You find out the strength of a wind by trying to walk against it, not by lying down. A man who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply does not know what it would have been like an hour later. That is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They have lived a sheltered life by always giving in. We never find out the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it. And Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, is also the only man to know to the full what temptation means. Right? The only man who's fully experienced it in all of its power.
What is the footnote to that?
Mere Christianity. I can get you the page number. It's in my office, but I don't have it with me right here. But I did not write that because that was excellent. But I think it really gets at the idea of, in our weakness, right? We can think something is so hard, and then you find out from a brother like, oh, he's been experiencing this temptation and fighting it for 40 years or something like that. Well, Christ, he experienced every temptation to the max in that sense, because he never gave in. And he had the devil himself trying to tempt him. And so I think another pastor puts it really, really well. So our need, and really the need of every Christian, right, who looks to Christ, is that we don't need a fellow loser to go represent us. We need a winner. We need a winner who can lead us to victory, not one who shares in our defeat. And so we don't need a sinner, we need a Savior, is how he puts it. And so when we're talking about Christ and how he's been tempted in all things like we are, yet without sin, that shouldn't make us go like, well, he doesn't really know what it's like. It should make us go, wow, he really knows what it's like, and he didn't give in. And so because of this, we have a high priest who is able to sympathize with us. He's able to understand. He's able to know exactly how we feel. And he's able to overcome all those things. And so that's why this passage here, chapter 2, in our memory verse, it's not joking when it says that he's able to help those who are being tempted. It's because he actually knows what it's like, and he actually is able to provide help. And so we kind of get this implication, okay, so now what? Therefore, verse 16, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace. Therefore, let us draw near the throne. So this is an idea of utter confidence, joyful confidence, boldly approaching God. And notice that it's the throne of grace. It's not the throne of wrath. There's going to be a day when Jesus is sitting on that throne and the people who are looking to him are not going to be finding grace. And it is going to be a throne of judgment. It's going to be terrifying in that sense. But here, we're not told that, right? We're told that we can go with confidence. We can walk right up to the throne, to the ruler of the universe, with confidence because of who he is, because he's gracious. And this is really the only way to receive mercy and find grace. I think he's been building this argument through the book of Hebrews. You don't find this through angels. You don't find this through Moses or through Joshua or even through what the high priest could even offer you, right? This is only found through this high priest and what he's done. And so it says, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So somebody explain to me what mercy is.
Not be given what you deserve.
Yeah. It's not receiving something you deserve. It's restraint. Restraint is being offered against something, and really it's God's wrath. God is restraining his wrath. And so that's what it means to receive mercy, to be given something so wonderful to a person who absolutely doesn't deserve it. Now, what does grace mean? Yeah, getting. I did just say it, didn't I? Yeah, it's receiving something that you did not deserve. So it's really God releasing his blessing, his favor, his love on people that don't deserve it at all. Not even a little bit. It's not even okay, he just did it to some people because they were kind of good. In no way do you deserve that at all. And so the idea here then is that we as believers, right, he's exhorting these people, right, in this time, and he's exhorting us too, to hold fast to our faith, to persevere in it, because he is the one that's going to keep us there. He is the one that is actually able to bring you into his presence, give you mercy, and give you grace. Yes?
The grace in verse 16, would it be more of the aspect of enablement?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yes, yeah, especially in this context for kind of like, how does this practically work out, right? Because at the end of that verse, he says, in our time of need. And so when are we in our time of need? I guess that's kind of the way to answer that question. When are we in our time of need?
Whenever we're breathing.
Yeah, whenever we're breathing. Yeah?
When it's called today.
Yeah, when it's called today. Yeah, I mean, in one sense, like we probably don't even ever fully recognize our need fully. But I think even really especially, it's like, yeah, when you're being tempted to not hold fast, when you are facing sin and it's hardening your heart, when you are looking at the road to unbelief, right? Like that is your time of need. And you don't have to like go on a long pilgrimage to Italy and walk up a whole bunch of steps or walk around some building in the Middle East, right? You don't have to do any of those things to immediately be in the presence of God and receive mercy and grace. It's right there at his throne that you get to approach boldly right now. Yes?
Right. In the Old Testament, it was like the prophets spoke for God to men, and the high priest, or the priest spoke for man to God.
Mm-hmm.
But man couldn't just walk up to God and talk.
Right.
Just like Esther feared to walk into
Right.
the king,
Right.
to walk into his presence. So this is a brand new open door, right?
It is.
That, I mean, it's called a throne of grace. It's a throne
Yeah.
which is intimidating,
Mhm.
which is a fearful thing to approach the king.
Right.
And yet it's a throne of grace.
Right.
It's just amazing.
Yeah, and he's seeding ideas here that he's going to talk about.
Chapter 9.
Yeah, chapter 9, chapter 10. And kind of getting to that idea of who's on the throne. I mean, he makes a very, very big point in chapter 2 to talk about us as brothers with Christ. That this isn't like we are some totally unknown alien to this person who's on the throne. It's like, no, you're his brother. You're in his family. Like, you can go to him right now. And so in our time of need, when we are being tempted, when we are, just burdened, when we're feeling trials and pain, when we are experiencing those things of weaknesses, right, that human condition, he is there to not only extend mercy, right, to forgive us of our sins, right, we're talking about our confession. Like we are believing in Jesus, that he died on the cross for our sins, that we get eternal life because of what he's done. It's that idea of justification. Like when God's looking at me, right, he's seeing Christ, but he's treating me like justification. What's one way to say it? Just as I've never sinned, and just as I've always obeyed, right? He's treating me like Christ when he's looking at me, and he's extending me mercy because of what Christ has done, and he's giving me power and strength. He's upholding me with his grace because of what Christ has done. And so this is the encouragement then. Like I think sometimes people, I mean, we see it all the time, right? When you're told to persevere, it just sounds like, oh, it's such a burden to be put on your back. Like you have to persevere as a Christian. Like what does that mean? That sounds like so much work. That's so hard. Well, here he's telling you like this isn't so hard because I'm here. I'm the one that's going to help you in your time of need. I'm going to be the one to provide for you. And so this is kind of the thesis, this idea of who Jesus is as our great high priest. This is really the thesis then that he's going to take kind of the first 10 verses of chapter 5 to explain further. But then really like kind of all the chapters all the way through chapter 10, he's going to really expound on this idea of what it means that Christ is our high priest. What is his priestly work? But for us right here, kind of the intended response is to persevere, to hold fast to your faith.
It's almost, this whole section is almost like, we say about just, I guess, repeating the gospel to yourself every day. Because it actually helps you fight temptation. When you realize you're saved by grace and what God's done for you. It's like, it makes you almost not want to sin.
Right.
Get you through those temptations.
Right. And we know that we have this merciful and faithful high priest who is there, right? Who is there to help us when we sin. I think that's the greatest thing. Like he's talking about He's providing mercy for people who have already been forgiven. Like, as in, like, you're going to be sinning again and again. Not that you should be wanting to do that, but that every time you do, right, you have someone who is there who is helping you and forgiving you and pointing you the right way. Okay, so that's 14 through 16. Let's move on now to chapter 5. In chapter 5, we're going to talk about this chapter for a little bit before we actually start diving into the text. It breaks down verses 1 through 4, and then 5 through 10. And it's kind of telling us the why. Like, why for verses 14 through 16. Like, we have this high priest. Here's who he is. Here's what he's done. But now he's going to tell us kind of like why he's done that. Like, how is he qualified to do this? Where did this come from? And the main point really continues. It's to hold fast, to draw near. But we're discovering the why. And really, the same idea is persisting here. That's kind of underlies a lot of these passages in Hebrews, that turning away from this is not good. Like, turning away from this is going to be spiritually catastrophic for you. So do not go back to the old priestly system. Do not turn away from Jesus. And so he's going to give us a contrast. He's going to explain kind of the role and the purposes of the priesthood of Aaron. And then he's going to compare that to the priesthood of Melchizedek, which is going to be fun for us to dive into. But he's going to do this in a chiasm. Does anyone know what a chiasm is? There's other ways to say that word too, so yeah.
It's what we call it is where it's kind of like a sandwich, really, and things work toward the middle. It's like half of an X.
Yeah.
Divided it vertically.
Yeah. All right, so if we were to make our X, all right, this is the Greek key. But what we're going to see here, actually in these verses, 1 through 10, is that we have a chiasm. He's going to take ideas and he's going to line them up against each other to make a point. And so kind of verses, actually let me pull it up here. It's for those of you who want to note this down. We have verse kind of 1, 2, and 3, and then 4. So that's kind of the A, B, C. So which kind of is implying that these ideas are connected to each other. And so then for the A, B, C kind of going the other way, we have 9 and 10. We have 7 and 8. And we have 5 and 6. So hopefully that makes sense to some people. So we have a chiasm. And so we'll kind of work our way through the first section and then kind of contrast it as we're going through the next section. But he's doing this to make a few key points. He wants us to kind of zoom in here, kind of like where it comes together and see that idea. But he wants us to see each of these things in comparison. And so we're going to start there with kind of like verse 1, which is A in the chiasm. And we're going to see kind of the old office of high priest, the old office of high priest. So let me read verse 1. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Okay, so the high priest, kind of the origins of the high priest, is that this guy is a man. And he was selected, he was chosen or even like appointed in that sense. But really, he's from men. He's of men. And so he represents men. And the line of Aaron is the high priestly line in really kind of the Bible, and how the families, the family of Aaron or Zadok, which is kind of the father of Moses and Aaron, And they have this special privilege as high priest. Not only are they doing priestly functions, but they're really representing all of the people, all of God's people, all of the priests. And they're representing humans, and they're providing gifts and sacrifices for sin. And so that's like thank offerings, sin offerings. The Day of Atonement was especially important. We're going to talk about that too in this letter. But notably, angels could not be high priests. They couldn't represent people at all because they weren't people. And so this special privilege to be a mediator, to be this high priest, was given to the line of Aaron. And so throughout all of our biblical history, as we see high priests mentioned, like they're going to be from this line. Interestingly, kind of after the return from exile, and really especially once Romans started controlling things, Rome saw kind of the benefit of having somebody that was very highly influential that they could control maybe as being this high priest. And so Rome started to even have orchestrations and put people that were not from the correct line into this position in Judea. And so clearly this was, it's outside of what God had said. And even kind of the conservative, true Jewish followers who were still trying to follow God, they were saying, this guy, he's not the high priest. He's not from the line of Aaron. He's not selected in that way. Okay, so we see first then that the office of high priest is selected. Okay, so next we'll see in B, so verses 2 through 3. Let me read those. This high priest, verse 2, being able to deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself is also beset with weaknesses. And because of it, he is obligated, just as for the people, to also offer sacrifices for sins in the same way for himself. So a way to say this is that he stands with the people. He represents the people. He's showing solidarity with them, and that he's just like them. He's not a different class of person. He's a full representative of humanity. And he's able to relate to care for, and understand those who are ignorant and led astray, because he also, in the very same way, is also stained with sin. So an ignorance here is really, I think it's talking about the sins of ignorance. And so in the Old Covenant law, there's like if you did something accidentally and you didn't even know, but it was a sin, right? There were special ways in order to proceed and to be like go from unclean to clean again. And so this way, the high priest would deal with people. Going astray, it's talking about, it's really what it is. It's straying from what's right, but coming back, right? Going astray, kind of pursuing sin, but coming back. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say dealing with those who go off in utter rebellion. And there's this idea that apostasy, like truly rejecting God, truly running away in unbelief, right? That's not something a high priest is going to deal with and save from. Which then is going to be an interesting point for us, too, if we go back to the previous few chapters when it was talking about the dangers of unbelief. Well, the dangers of unbelief exist for God's people today in that sense. And so that's a key thread that goes through. But notably, this priest, he's showing solidarity with the people. He's caring for them. He's able to sympathize with them, but in a way that he just shares the same human condition with them. He shares the same weaknesses. He shares the same sins. And really, the weakness of this line of priests is that he also had his own sin as a barrier between him and God. And so he also was required to make an offering for himself as well as the people. Okay, so now C, verse 4. And no one takes this honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. All right, so we're getting to this big idea that he's wanting us to kind of hone in on where we get our new high priest and where high priests came from in general. And he's saying that this is not a democratically elected position. Right? The high priest was called and chosen by God. And so it had to be from the line of Aaron, and God chose Aaron. He's like, you are going to be a priest for me. Like, it wasn't like they voted on who the best guy was going to be. No, God chose Aaron. So this choice is very important. And so you can see why then when Rome would choose a priest, how just utterly in the face of what God's plan was, and how the Jews then would react to that. But all of this is really setting up a comparison with Jesus, the Son of God, the high priest that we have. And so there, now Hebrews verses 5 through 10, we're going to see Christ as this priest. And first, in verses 5 and 6, which really is paralleling verse 4, and it's kind of our main idea that we're getting out of this section, is that Christ was also appointed as a priest. So it's basically trying to show Jesus qualifies as a high priest because he's going to be able to say the same things that the high priest in the Old Testament could say about himself. And so first, we have to say, well, Aaron was appointed. Is Jesus appointed? The answer is yes. Jesus did not appoint himself, and neither did Jesus. So verses 5 through 6. In this way, Christ also did not glorify himself to become a high priest, but he who said to him, you are my son, today I've begotten you, just as he says also in another passage, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so we're back in our fun psalm quotations and wondering what's going on. We should recognize the first one, right? Where was the first one already seen in Hebrews? And where is it from originally? Not Psalm 95.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, this one. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Psalm 2:7. And we kind of saw it right at the beginning when I was talking about beginning of Hebrews in chapter 1, when it's talking about who Christ is. And so it's interesting, though, because there, right, what were we talking about when we were talking in chapter 1? We were talking about the Son being an heir, being the king, right? We weren't talking about priestly things at all. So we have to say, okay, author of Hebrews, what are you doing? Like, why are you quoting a passage to say we have a priest, he was appointed a priest, when you quote a passage that's not talking about him being appointed a priest? Well, it's like a little appetizer. It's supposed to key our minds to a certain detail that he's going to be bringing up. And so he's going to Psalm 2:7 to show us that Jesus, right, he's the one that's talked about there, that he is the Son, that he's the heir to all things, he's the king, he has a throne. And that king idea is supposed to be very important. He is going to be a priest king, just like somebody else in the Bible. So now we get to verse 6. Just as he says also in another passage, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So this is quoting Psalm 110. It's a messianic psalm. It's David talking about kind of the promises that and kind of forecasting what this Messiah is going to do. And for us in Hebrews, this is the first mention of Melchizedek. And in general, in the Bible, there are not a lot of mentions of Melchizedek and what he does. He first pops up in Genesis 14 when Abraham is pursuing kind of the people who had kidnapped Lot, and he takes kings with him, and he's fighting against other kings. He's victorious in the end, and he basically gives an offering to this Melchizedek guy who comes out of nowhere and then disappears. That's going to be kind of important, actually. And so we'll talk about Melchizedek more as we go through Hebrews. But the other time he's mentioned in the Old Testament is in Psalm 110, which is what's quoted here. And then he's mentioned here in Hebrews. And so Psalm 110 is this prophecy about this future king. He'll reign, he'll have the scepter, he'll crush his enemies, he'll be on the throne. But this king, he's not a king only, which is why this verse, verse 4 in Psalm 110 is so important. He's not a king only, he's also a priest. He's also a priest. And so that's where you have that quote about this king. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And so he's a priest, and he's a priest from a different line than Aaron. Right? Well, so much of our Bible is all about lineage and who is connected to who and how God was working through these different lines. Well, God is making a very big point to talk about this being a different line. And we're going to talk about that even more in Hebrews later on, about this Melchizedek guy. But he's trying to bring us this point out, that this priest is a different line, and so therefore this high priest, he's a different type of priest. He's a priest king, just like Melchizedek was. And he didn't pick this. He didn't pick this. He was also appointed, just like these priests, the Old Covenant high priests were appointed. So why does this matter? Well, the author is showing us this entirely unique appointment to a new priesthood. And so by implication, right, the old priesthood had its own rules, had its own covenant, and had its own way of doing things. And so now we have a new priest. And so what's the thing that we should be expecting? Well, we have a new priesthood, which has new rules, has a new covenant, and has a new way of doing things. And so he's contrasting Christ, this high priest, with the old high priests. All right, next, there in verses 7 and 8, we see that this high priest also has solidarity with his people. But we have another contrast, right? Just like the old high priest could help his people because he was weak like us, like we were, Jesus, as a high priest, well, actually, let me read verses 7 and 8, because that would make more sense if we read it. He, in the days of his flesh, offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. So the old priest was like us. We had solidarity. We were standing on the same ground because he was weak like we are. Jesus empathizes with us, not from a condition of weakness, but from a condition or from a position of piety and strength. So, and we saw that was kind of why we had that precursor in verses 14 through 16. That he is like us and that he is a human and he has experienced temptation. He has experienced the anguish of being a human. He has experienced everything that happens to somebody in the flesh and the heartache, yet he did not sin. And so in that sense, he's stronger, he's better than the priest that does sin. Because with the priest that does sin, there was a barrier. There was a barrier between that priest and God that he had to constantly remove before he could even act on behalf of the people. Well, for this high priest, there's no such barrier. And so he's able to be the perfect mediator in that sense. We see there in verse 7 that he offered up both prayers and supplications. Does anyone have other words for those two words? Loud cries and appeals, petitions. So prayers, that's kind of loud cries even. Like that's the same idea that we have for our prayer requests in that sense of going to God and asking for Him, asking things of Him when we're in need. But the idea of supplication is not a common word, and it's not something that is going to be as familiar to us. It's really this desperate petition. It's somebody at their wits' end. It's this franticness that's characterizing everything about this person. And so we see that Jesus, he prayed, and he was at his wits' end. He was crying out. He was frantic. He was desperate. He had a visible, an audible proof of this, right? He had loud cries. He had tears. Why? Why does it talk about Jesus like this? What is this talking about with Jesus?
My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah, it's that whole those last few days of Jesus' life, especially him in the garden, and then him on the cross. And this is kind of the pinnacle, in a bad way, if you can put it that way, the pinnacle of the weight, the crushing weight of temptation, of agony, of bearing the sins of all those who would save, taking all of that and then taking God's wrath upon him, right, brought him to this position of just absolute desperation, being absolutely crushed. And he did pray, right? He did pray, God, Lord, if your will be done, but can you take this cup away from me? This cup of your wrath that's being poured out that I'm about to drink, can you take it away? But not my will be done, but yours. And so, I don't think we can say, well, Jesus gave into temptation there. But I think that gives us a glimpse into the absolute panic and sorrow and desperation that he was experiencing. And so we see there that Jesus is the one that he's praying to the one who was able to save him from death. And so there's a couple of different ways to take that. One is that he was praying to be saved so that he didn't have to die on the cross. And I think maybe there's something there. But I think maybe just more strongly, he's praying to the one that is going to save him from death, that is going to raise him to life again, is going to bring about that resurrection. But that didn't lessen the pain or the sorrow at all in that sense. But we see that Jesus, he can empathize not because he's broken and sinful just like we are, but because in fighting temptation, he was broken, and he was broken on our behalf. But he conquered it from a position of strength. And so we see there in verse 8 that although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And this is a complicated verse. And if you just get this verse out of context and someone just tells you this, you're like, what? Jesus did what? How can the God of the universe learn something, right? Well, this learned obedience, I think it's saying that he gave up his privileges to suffer. It wasn't that he was foolish or didn't understand something, but he had to experience something new. He had to experience something new so that he could be an actual high priest, to be the mediator for us to God. He had to experience what it was to be in those trials, to be tempted, to face that death on the cross, right? That it hadn't happened to the Son until the incarnation. And so what we're talking about here is his human incarnation, in that he had to submit his will, his human will, to the Father's divine will. And in that way we can see that he learned obedience. And he learned it perfectly. And he learned it perfectly on our behalf. And so in that way, he's the winner, the conqueror that we need to fully represent us and offer a better sacrifice. All right, lastly there, verses 9 and 10. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So here we're getting this contrast with the first point of this chapter. The old priest had to continually offer sacrifices. Jesus was a perfect, and he accomplished the task. And so perfection, really here in Hebrews, but also throughout Hebrews, is tied to this idea of suffering and death and his obedience and his exaltation. And it's not that He was not perfect and then he became perfect, but that these things were like fully realized, fully displayed, fully finalized. And really before the incarnation, before the events in the garden, before the events on the cross, in some ways, right, his perfection was this abstraction. It wasn't fully realized. It wasn't fully displayed. But as he obeyed God, as he really saw and faced all these realities of the trials of human life, his suffering and his death equipped him to be perfect in that sense, to qualify him to serve as a priest, to serve as our representative. It wasn't that God wasn't perfect, that the Son wasn't perfect, but that in doing all these things, living this life, he was the absolute perfect representative. And so this is seeing the new office of high priest. And so we have this contrast with the old high priest was for all of God's people, for all the Jews, for all of the people that were living in the land under God's law. Notice, who is Jesus a high priest for? Verse 9. Yes, so we have a new distinction for who God's people are. It's for all those who obey him. So in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, right, the priest was just the priest for all the people, for all Israel, right? If Israel was great, or it wasn't great. Like, he was still the priest for all of Israel. Well, here, Jesus is the priest for those who obey him, those who are truly his. And that's kind of where we're getting that idea of perseverance and faith and obedience and how all those things come together. Well, he's our high priest, right? For those people, he's their high priest. The old priest had to offer gifts and sacrifices continually. Notice gifts and sacrifices. What's something that's common with both those words? They're both plural, right? There's this ongoing continualness to this old priestly system. What did Jesus do? Once, right? He's the source of eternal salvation, like singular, done, right? That is it. So there's no more temporary solutions just providing stopgaps, right? There's an eternal solution now. And so this is really highlighting this absolute change, this role difference between this new high priest who's better and the old high priests. And so just like kind of at the beginning of the chapter where we see that every high priest is appointed, right? We see here that Jesus was also appointed. He's declared to be a priest, and his origins are different. They're not the line of Aaron. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And it's not like there was a whole bunch of Melchizedek priests that were running around. It's really talking about the type in the sense that he is like Melchizedek.
Well, Melchizedek was a priest king.
Yeah.
Of the Most High God.
Yes, some of that's going to be brought up later, but it's this idea of origin too, in the sense that the line of Aaron, you can trace the line of Aaron and you can see all the sin in the line of Aaron. And you can know that he's in this sinful line, right? And yet here that he's a priest and he's outside of that. He's in a new line, a new order, a better order. And the kind of each of these reasons why is why he's better than the old order of priests. And so the author of Hebrews, he wants to explain this further. He wants to talk about how Jesus is this better high priest, how he is in this new order of priesthood, how he's able to represent us. But this is going to be what we're going to be talking about next week. He has to first give a warning. He has to correct some people that are in this church that he's writing to, or churches that he's writing to, because this idea of a Melchizedekian priesthood is complicated, and he's worried that the people that he's writing to aren't going to get it. And that's a good thing for us to also hear, so that we can understand it better. So let's go ahead and let me pray, and then in 3 minutes we'll just discuss some of those questions that are on your sheet. The big idea, though, is that we're being told to hold fast to our confession because of who our priest is and what he's done for us and how we now have this relationship with God. So let me pray, and then kind of 3 minutes of discussion questions, and then we'll get out of here. Lord, we thank you for your Son, that you, before time began, before the foundations of the world, had this plan to accomplish salvation through him. That you sent him to be the Lamb, to be the sacrifice, to be the priest, and to be our King. And I pray that we would come to know those truths fully, that we'd be encouraged by them, that they would help us to hold fast in our faith, to persevere to the end, to fight sin, to fight unbelief, and to cling to you, and just see you for the wonderful God who you are, and how you offer eternal salvation to all who believe in your Son. I pray this in your name. Amen.